It was a late, moonless night, and I was driving home after a long day at work. The road was empty, with only the occasional flicker of my headlights illuminating the way. I was eager to get home, the quiet hum of my car providing a semblance of comfort. As I drove along the winding country road, something caught my eye. There, on the side of the road, stood a woman dressed in a flowing white dress. She seemed out of place, standing so still in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I considered driving past, but something compelled me to stop. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Are you all right?" I called out. She turned to face me, and I could see her eyes glistening with tears. "I need help," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. I got out of the car and approached her. She looked pale and fragile, as if she might disappear at any moment. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She pointed down the road, towards a dark, wooded area. "My car broke down. I need to get home," she whispered. I offered her a ride, and she nodded gratefully. We got back into the car, and she directed me to a small, unmarked road leading into the woods. The air grew colder as we drove deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around us. As we drove, I tried to make conversation. "What's your name?" I asked. She remained silent, staring straight ahead. I felt a growing unease, but I pushed it aside. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Just here," she said, pointing to a clearing up ahead. I stopped the car, and she turned to me, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, before stepping out of the car. I watched as she walked towards the edge of the clearing, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. I waited for a moment, expecting her to wave or give some indication that she was all right, but she simply vanished into the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something didn't feel right. I turned the car around and headed back to the main road, my mind racing. When I reached the safety of the highway, I pulled over to gather my thoughts. I decided to call the local police, just in case she needed more help. The officer who answered listened to my story, and then asked me to meet him at the station. When I arrived, he showed me a photograph. "Is this the woman you saw?" he asked. My blood ran cold as I recognized her face. "Yes, that's her," I replied. The officer sighed and shook his head. "She's been missing for years," he said. "Many people have reported seeing her on that road, but no one knows what happened to her. They say she wanders the woods, looking for help, but when someone stops, she vanishes." I left the station feeling a mix of fear and sadness. To this day, I can't shake the image of her standing by the roadside, her eyes pleading for help. Every time I drive down a lonely road at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman in white, forever seeking the way home. I've always enjoyed taking late night drives. There's something about the empty roads and the quiet of the night that I find calming. One night, I decided to take a route I hadn't driven in years, a lonely stretch of road that winds through a dense forest. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the trees. As I drove, I saw something up ahead on the side of the road. It was an old, abandoned car. It seemed out of place, just sitting there with its driver's door ajar. Curious, I pulled over to take a closer look. I got out of my car and approached the abandoned vehicle. The air felt colder as I neared it, and a sense of unease settled over me. The car was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it had been there for some time, but there was something else: fresh bloodstains on the driver's seat and the steering wheel. My heart began to race. I looked around, half expecting to see someone emerging from the woods, but there was nothing but silence. I debated calling the police, but my phone had no signal. I decided to investigate further, hoping to find some clue about what had happened. I checked the back seat and the trunk, but found nothing. The more I looked, the stronger the feeling of dread grew. It was as if the car itself was trying to tell me something terrible had happened here. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound coming from the trees. I froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I hurried back to my car, glancing over my shoulder as I went. The abandoned car seemed to loom larger in the moonlight, a dark presence against the pale road. I got back into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking. As I started the engine, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. A shadowy figure was standing near the abandoned car, watching me. I couldn't make out any features, but the figure's presence was menacing. I hit the gas and sped away, my mind racing. I drove straight to the nearest town and found a place with cell reception. I called the police and reported what I had seen. They assured me they would investigate and asked for my details. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had found the car, but there was no sign of the bloodstains or the figure I had seen. They asked if I was sure about what I had witnessed, and I insisted that I was. It was well past midnight, and I was alone on a long stretch of highway. My fuel gauge was dangerously low, and the road ahead was empty. Just as I started to panic, a flickering neon sign appeared through the fog of a gas station. Relieved, I pulled in, but an unsettling chill crept over me. The place looked frozen in time, with peeling paint and flickering lights casting eerie shadows. I parked by a pump and got out, scanning the area. There wasn't a soul in sight, but the lights inside the station were on, so I headed for the door. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. An old man stood behind the counter, his eyes fixed on me as if he'd been expecting someone. "Evening," he said, in a voice that grated like sandpaper. "Need some gas?" I nodded, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the other pumps were covered in cobwebs, as if they hadn't been used in years. I shook off the feeling and started fueling up. When I returned to pay, the old man leaned forward, his gaze unnerving. "Where you headed?" he asked, voice low. "Just passing through," I replied, feigning confidence. He handed me my change, his fingers cold as ice. "Be careful out there," he warned. "Strange things happen on these roads at night." His words sent a chill racing down my spine. Hurrying back to my car, I started the engine and drove away. Glancing in the rearview mirror, the old man was still there, watching me with those piercing eyes. A few miles down the road, my radio crackled to life with strange static. I fiddled with the dial, but it wouldn't change. The static rose to an unbearable pitch, then abruptly stopped, plunging the car into eerie silence. As I drove on, the fog thickened, and I felt a growing sense of dread. Suddenly, headlights appeared ahead, cutting through the mist. A car approached, its windows dark and inscrutable. As it passed, I glanced over and froze. The driver was the old man from the gas station, his expression blank, eyes locked straight ahead. My heart pounded as I pressed the accelerator, desperate to escape. When I finally reached home, I felt a wave of relief, but the encounter haunted me. Later, I discovered the gas station had been abandoned for years, ever since a string of mysterious disappearances on that highway. It was a late Saturday night, and I was driving home after visiting a friend in a nearby town. The highway was deserted, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I enjoyed the solitude of night drives, the quiet and the sense of calm they brought. But this night would be different. I was about halfway home when I heard a faint sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I slowed down and rolled down the window, I heard it more clearly. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby crying, echoing through the night. I pulled over to the side of the road, the crying growing louder and more desperate. My heart raced as I stepped out of the car, the cool night air sending a shiver down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and started towards the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from the dense woods lining the road. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" The crying continued, a pitiful wail that tugged at my heart. I pushed through the underbrush, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. After a few minutes of searching, I came to a small clearing. The crying seemed to be coming from just beyond it. As I stepped into the clearing, the crying abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I swung the flashlight around, trying to see if I could spot anything, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided to head back to the car. As I turned, my flashlight caught something on the ground, an old, tattered blanket. It looked like it had been there for years, partially buried under fallen leaves. My heart pounded as I picked it up. There was no sign of a baby, no footprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been there recently. I rushed back to my car, my mind racing. I slammed the door shut, locking it for good measure. As I sat there, trying to calm down, I heard the crying again, this time fainter, as if it were moving away from the road. I put the car in gear and sped off, the sound fading into the distance. It was an unusually cold night, and I was driving home on a remote stretch of highway, far from any signs of civilization. The road was straight, but the trees on either side seemed to close in, their shadows stretching across the asphalt like dark, looming fingers. The only light came from my car's headlights, piercing the darkness. The quiet was unsettling. Just as I started to relax into the rhythmic hum of the engine, something strange happened. My car suddenly jolted, and the engine sputtered. The headlights flickered, then dimmed to a ghostly glow. I pressed the accelerator, but the car seemed to be mired in an invisible quagmire. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to maintain control, but the car felt like it was moving through thick sludge. The brakes were barely responding, and I could see the trees coming closer and closer. My pulse quickened, and panic set in. I tried to pull over, but the car wouldn't cooperate. It felt as though an unseen force was holding it back. I finally managed to bring the car to a stop on the side of the road, the engine still sputtering. I stepped out, my breath visible in the cold air. The silence was deafening. The road seemed normal, no ice, no debris. My car, however, seemed to be enveloped in an eerie stillness. As I tried to figure out what was wrong, I noticed something strange. The air around the car felt unnaturally cold, almost icy. A shiver ran down my spine as I heard a low, distant hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound grew louder, a relentless drone that seemed to seep into my bones. I got back into the car, desperate to leave. When I restarted the engine, it roared to life as if nothing had happened. The headlights were bright again, and the car felt perfectly normal. Relieved, I drove off, but my nerves were on edge. The road ahead seemed to stretch into an abyss. Every shadow seemed to move, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. The hum from earlier faded, but the oppressive silence that replaced it was equally unsettling. When I finally reached home, I was shaken. I couldn't get the incident out of my mind, so I decided to investigate. The next day, I returned to the spot in broad daylight. The road was clear, the trees were just trees, and there was no sign of anything unusual. But the locals I spoke to had their own stories. They spoke of a stretch of road where cars inexplicably lose power and control. Some believed it was due to a magnetic anomaly. Others whispered of a tragic accident from years ago, a driver who had died under mysterious circumstances. It was one of those nights where the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home after a long day. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I was halfway through my journey when I began to feel an inexplicable chill. My car's interior was perfectly warm, but the feeling of cold was unsettling. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, but everything seemed normal, just the empty backseat behind me. As I continued driving, the chill intensified. It was as if the temperature in the car was dropping rapidly. I adjusted the heater, but it didn't make a difference. The cold persisted, and I began to feel increasingly uneasy. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder into the back seat, half expecting to see something, but it was always empty. Then, I felt a cold, heavy presence in the back of the car. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the usual back seat with the shadowy outlines of the car's interior. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The sensation grew more intense, and I could almost feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. It was as if someone or something was right behind me, just out of sight. I pulled over to the side of the road, turned on the interior light, and checked the back seat thoroughly. There was nothing there, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Feeling slightly reassured, but still on edge, I got back into the car and continued my drive. The oppressive cold seemed to follow me, and every little noise made me jump. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, my anxiety growing with every mile. When I finally reached home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the back seat with me. I checked the car thoroughly again, but everything was as it should be. I spent the rest of the night restless, replaying every moment in my head. It was well past midnight, and I had been driving for hours on an isolated highway, feeling the fatigue of the journey. My stomach was growling, and I was desperate for a break. As I rounded a bend, a dim, flickering neon sign caught my eye. A diner, of all things, in the middle of nowhere. Relieved, I pulled into the parking lot, hoping for a quick bite. The moment I walked through the door, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The diner was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every small noise seem amplified. The neon lights outside barely illuminated the dusty interior, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. I was greeted by a bell's soft jingle and an elderly woman behind the counter. Her smile was tired and vacant, her eyes distant as she handed me a menu. I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she set it down. I took a seat at the counter, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The diner's booths were occupied, but by figures shrouded in shadows, their faces hidden from view. I could feel their eyes on me, though none of them moved or spoke. The stillness was unnerving. When I ordered, the elderly woman disappeared into the back, leaving me alone with the unsettling ambience. The patrons continued to watch me, their gazes unblinking and cold. The silence grew heavier, and the dim lights seemed to flicker more frequently. Moments later, the woman returned with my food, her movements robotic. As she placed the plate in front of me, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to eat, but the food tasted bland and unappetizing. Every bite felt like a chore as the oppressive atmosphere weighed on me. Without warning, the power went out. The entire diner plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the neon sign outside, casting eerie shadows through the windows. The silence was now punctuated by an occasional creak and the soft hum of something just out of sight. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but the moment I switched it on, the diner's lights flickered back to life. The elderly woman and the patrons remained exactly as they were, their expressions unchanged, their stares more intense than before. My unease escalated. I finished my meal quickly, paid at the counter, and made a beeline for the door. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the diner. The woman and the patrons were still watching me, their eyes following my every move. Their faces seemed even more distorted in the flickering light. Once outside, I hurried to my car and started driving, my heart racing. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me as I drove away. I couldn't shake the image of those vacant eyes staring through the window. The next day, I researched the diner and found out it had been closed for years. There were rumors that on some nights, it would appear as if it were still operational. Locals spoke of strange occurrences and ghostly figures in the diner, trapped in a timeless loop.